Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Even though it's 4:30, the room is dark. I'm working with East Coast timing. I know there's some people here from Europe and South America as well, so we'll get through it. There's coffee in the hall. Right, but thank you again so much for having me at the first iteration of the Cloud Native Geospatial Conference. I haven't been to this conference before, which obviously none of you have as well, but I'm a little bit of an odd bird to be here. First of all, let me tell you a little about IDC. For those of you who don't know, it does not stand for I don't care. When I first took the job, my kids were like, what? How could you work at a place called that? Once upon a time, known as the International Data Corporation, and we just go by IDC now. We're an international firm of technology analysts looking at hardware, software, and industry-specific technology markets. My particular area of coverage is looking at data collaboration, including location and geospatial intelligence. So as Jed explained, that's why we've crossed paths, and I've crossed paths, I know, with a number of you over the years. For me, I've been covering this data collaboration space for about 8 years here. Prior to that, I was an external consultant with some firms you've probably heard of in the tech space, and then worked internally at a couple of big companies. But my role as an analyst is to work with IDC's 3 main constituencies: technology vendors, so people who are selling, whether it's data, hardware, software, et cetera, in this space; with enterprise technology buyers, so some of the firms that you guys work for or the firms that you work with; and then the third one, which sometimes takes me on some odd tangents, tech investors in companies in this space. They, to me, ask some of the most interesting and, frankly, naive questions. Usually, I can get a laugh out of a location or geospatial crowd from one of the questions that I got a couple years back, which was point of interest data. Why would anyone buy that, and what makes it interesting? Okay. Where should we start? Clearly, it's new for you to be investing in this space. But I think the question that I'm going to focus on throughout this presentation is at a different angle from what the most of the rest of this conference looks at. Kind of my overarching question here is, can demand for what the people in this room do and the constituencies you represent keep up with the supply of data and ideas and possibilities? You know, usually we're talking about, can we come up with the supply that meets the demand? But I feel very strongly that there are so many more things that can be done with geospatial data, geospatial intelligence, that we need to grow a bigger appetite. We need to grow bigger interest. And I think I'm giving away my grow slide with the little plant on it, much like Chris had this morning. But that's what we're going to be talking about. In the idea of getting stakeholder wins is creating that demand. How do you create sustainable demand? And by the way, with that demand comes the funding and the groundswell of interest, as I realize many people are needing to pivot from what had been some of the more reliable places that you had, gotten stakeholders from. I'll also say that my usual audience that I go and speak to tends to be more in the technology vendor space or in the enterprise technology buyer space, where they're talking more about, why would I do this? Why would I make an investment? I don't understand what this could possibly do. So even for me, this is a little bit of a different angle today. So on my agenda, just talking a little about strategies for aligning geospatial innovation with stakeholder priorities. We'll do just kind of some quick things about some of the stakeholders to be considering, some lessons from real-world wins, and I will tell you that a lot of my emphasis and the technology buyers that I speak with are mostly commercial enterprises. Some of it is that, government and NGO types of entities don't tend to go to those sorts of vendor-side events, or, the way that they contract is a very different process. But a lot of these the couple of real-world wins that I'd like to highlight kind of go at the intersection of where commercial entities and some of the more historic public entities or nonprofit entities have had an interest, but we can really merge those two because they do actually have some common and overlapping goals. And then I'm going to have to talk about AI, because if I don't talk about AI, then I can't be an analyst anymore, and I really like this job. Okay, so I didn't even know Chris was going to show a plant in the beginning. I already had a plant here. But this is all about growth. The whole reason to talk about stakeholders and talk about their demands and how to entice more people to be stakeholders in the processes and technologies you're building is to grow. We want to grow the profession. I am not going to ask for a show of hands of how many people here think of themselves as GIS professionals. How many think of yourselves as data scientists? It doesn't matter. The profession is really this community of practice, people who are taking geospatial and adding value and insight to a wider group of constituencies with what you can put into it. That grows the influence, right? It grows the number of people that you can speak to, that you can talk about the value of what you do, and I think ultimately grows the impact of how these technologies and techniques impact the world around us. And I know that a lot of people in this room are very mission-driven, and it can be uncomfortable to be just talking about, well, where are people going so we can target ads to them? I'd like to understand people's routes so I know before they go to the stadium, they tend to stop off, and get some snacks. But we can grow impact by understanding more and more case studies. A lot of what I think is unfortunate when it comes to the data world writ large is that we, as people who are really excited about data and see and draw our own conclusions, maybe fall a little bit short in telling the stories. People really connect with stories. As we're exchanging here about what we've done personally, professionally, for our stakeholders, right? That's how we're building some of that connection, even if it's the story about how I built a better mousetrap, right? So this is about really creating effective stories that communicate with that group of stakeholders. Now, there's a lot of amazing technology and standards that are getting talked about today, but how many of you here attended the one and only film ever shot in smell-o-vision? And the thing is, it is one. There was one movie. It was very breakthrough technology at the time, right? No one else had done it. No one else had added that additional, sense to the movie-going experience. And I think it's really funny what they put on the poster, right? First they moved, then they talked, and now they smell. Well, no one cared. The technology was sort of messy. Obviously, right, it's difficult to clear the room of the first scent when you go to bring in the second one. And it didn't have an audience. And it is amazing technology. I don't maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we made a trip to Walt Disney World. And there was a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movie that included sensory feedback. So there were winds blowing and water squirting. And it doesn't mean that people aren't innovating, right, around how to make the movie-going experience more immersive. Or I attended some very interesting presentations at CES in January. I don't know if any of you were there, about how even the concert-going experience is becoming more 3D. But smell-o-vision was not the answer. So this is just kind of the funny reminder, as you're rolling things out that are new, isn't the smell-o-vision. We've got a lot of different potential stakeholders out there. And I say stakeholders and not customers because people have different vested interests in the data sets or the technology or the interactive map or what have you that you're rolling out. We in our research have found, right, executives are very outcome focused. Now, that outcome can be financial or it can have other determinations too, right? It could be better, faster, cheaper, more impact, draws our market share. I've seen a lot of really interesting technologies coming out that make use of geospatial data and interactivity for field staff. And we'll talk about a case study a little bit later, but the ability to put pertinent information at the time and place where a field service worker is out there working with a power line or some other kind of asset, or there's a full gamut of things they could be working on, but the power of that being there and being live is huge. And then, one of the largest constituencies, right, around public agencies, this is about trust. Is the data absolutely right? Are we sharing only what we should share? And a lot of you are probably used to that very risk-averse kind of culture when you roll out new projects. And the truth is that on the commercial side, depending on what that application is filling the need for, speed may be a little more important than accuracy. Or there are other factors, really that come into play. But to take stock of what your different stakeholders are looking to have you deliver. And we've done some research about, who are the stakeholders, how are you measuring that outcome? And it's this huge, almost spiraling planets, right, of the different kinds of metrics. Yes, some of them are financial, right? We want to be cost efficient, but it's also how can we get ideas about new services or new ways, to get to our customers or our citizens? How can we provide our citizens with better service or a better understanding of the service that they could have? The other thing I want to talk to you about as far as the message is, yes, we have to tailor the message, but I think that time frame is also something really important to contemplate. That most of the projects that you guys in the room work on, you don't have somebody come to you today and you have the answer tomorrow. A lot of these are a lot longer term. So how do you set interim goals and discussions so that you can have that agreement on what is it that you're going to get today? What are we capable of today? And what's kind of in that project roadmap? So what's coming tomorrow? And I used the next day really to talk about longer term, that vision of what is this going to enable? What are we going to be able to do fundamentally differently? Because we're considering geolocation as part of our analysis, as part of our process. It's really a different way of thinking for a lot of people who hadn't been exposed to this dimension before. I'd written an article quite a while back, and I think that Drew has this part of his headline for his presentation on Friday, but there was a time when people didn't do time series analysis because it was too difficult, right? They didn't, so we're going to do analytics, but we're not going to consider time as a factor in creating our conclusions. Well, anybody would look at you like you're crazy right now if you don't consider time. But the folks outside of this room don't always consider place. Why do things happen where they're happening? Or what is it about that location that's driving activity that might not have been apparent as we looked at the other factors that are a traditional part of analysis? So back to working with the stakeholder group. This is just kind of a pretty usual change management list of events, but one of the authors that I read early in my career that was really influential was Stephen Covey. I don't know how many of you have read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? But starting this out with, seek first to understand. What do your stakeholders want? Why are they greenlighting this project? Why are they interested? Why are they enthusiastic? Why are they not so enthusiastic? What things do they consider difficult or roadblocks? And how can you make that part of your plan to work through the things that they've identified? There's also the kind of, I suppose it's been memed by now, right? You have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as often as you speak. I think that's true in gathering these stakeholder requirements. And don't forget yourself as a stakeholder and your team. What is it that you want to be able to get out of this effort? Is this something that you're looking to write up in a scientific journal or publish findings about? Is this something that you're hoping to do a pilot so that you can teach others? Is this something that, is a building block to something that you have as a 2nd or 3rd order principle that you're trying to do? Again, focusing on outcomes. We had done some research as well about what makes for a geospatially mature organization. Is it a couple of GIS people sitting in the basement, or maybe 2 departments sitting in different basements that don't speak to each other? Or is this something where the leaders of the organization talk about how vital geospatial data, geospatial understanding are to their planning and operations? When we did that survey, only 37% of the enterprises that we interviewed, and this was a US and Canada study, said that they have measurable outcomes that they regularly track about the projects. That's not good. I think that we all start with the best of intentions. But if we can't be giving people those updates about, how did this have something measurable happen? Are we able to do something that we couldn't do before? Can we do something that we were doing before with fewer people? Is it better aligned to our mission because we're bringing this information in? I know competitive advantage isn't so much a public entity thing, but when you're talking about commercial enterprises, is adding the dimension of geospatial and location giving them an advantage that other enterprises aren't examining today? And I'll tell you, if only 37% are measuring, an awful lot aren't putting that into consideration. And then, even if you can't affirm the positive, maybe it's risk mitigation or understanding the amount of risk exposure that you have. I'm just adding in here what we call the so what chain. It doesn't matter what technology you're talking about. I think a lot of us get excited about features. When I worked in consulting, I had a manager who was very excited that the firm had rolled out a 3-step process. I'm like, he's like, yeah, and that's what they'll be excited about. It's 3 steps. I don't think that's the answer, right? That's just a feature. Let's talk about the capability that that feature gives you. And okay, having that capability, so what? So what if I have a scalable API that allows me to bring more data, on demand? Well, what's the benefit? Oh, wait, the benefit is I get that data back faster. Okay, faster data. A lot of times our stakeholders kind of lack the imagination. Like, this becomes shorthand for people who are really immersed in the technology about what it is that the features or capabilities or even those technology-based benefits are going to deliver. But I'll tell you, the only way to know for sure that they understand what that outcome should be from that benefit is to tell them and to pressure test that that is actually an outcome that they're hoping to achieve. Right? Because any new technology, any new process brings with it a certain amount of fear, right? And people have to overcome whatever that objection is, right, in order to be able to realize and get excited about that outcome. So just some pictures to remind you of the case studies I wanted to talk about. In the agenda, I said, oh, wait, I'm going to talk about some missteps and, what did people do wrong? And in my experience and the research that we do, we don't find a whole lot of missteps that come from overpromising, but a lot of failing to continue to get the stakeholders engaged in utilizing what you built. Maybe they didn't understand it at the outset, but we see, especially in this space, a lot more abandoned projects than projects where people are just like disappointed. It's that it had kind of a one-time use. So remember I said I was going to talk more about kind of the commercial side. So the first one is Walmart. They do very sophisticated disaster planning. But they look at it through 2 different lenses. One is what I'll call kind of Walmart as the organism. How is Walmart going to be affected and impacted by upcoming emergency situations, right? They see a storm coming. Which stores, distribution centers, routes are going to be impacted? Might they have to close? Might they have to shift employees from one place to another? All about the logistics of operating their business, right? So they're using much of the forecasting kinds of information that many of you guys touch. But there's also the other side of why Walmart is looking at that same data. And that's to figure out, hey, which stores are we putting the shovels in? Where are we going to have the extra umbrellas? Who's probably going to need generators? And so it's a sophisticated use, right? Like, there's a lot of risk-based planning or even immediate in-the-time planning around disasters. But Walmart, has coordinated a team looking at both sides of this. The middle one is about, I'll say the word out loud, infrastructure and construction. And what we're finding is more and more of the construction projects, particularly roads and bridges, but some others in the AEC industry, are asking bidders, when they put in to bid on a construction job, to have active platforms or mitigation plans to deal with things like additional congestion, rerouting, even some of the pollution impacts of changing traffic patterns, or bringing huge amounts of supplies to a particular location. And how would that play itself out? So again, making use of a lot of the same kinds of techniques, right? And same kinds of monitoring. And the third one is what I referenced earlier about field service personnel. We're just seeing more and more opportunities to get data in the hands of the field worker where they are. And that includes not just the kind of geospatial data that they may be collaborating across different spaces, but some of the company's own things like asset information, customer histories, so that that field worker doesn't have to make calls, and so that it's easy for that person to log the work that they're doing, right? The device itself is monitoring where is that person. By having that geolocation, it can say under what kinds of physical conditions was that person working when they installed A, B, or C item. How long did it take? Really simplifying the paperwork part, which was never the most rewarding thing that a field service person did. And bringing it back in a way that the back office gets all the information that they need in a lower friction manner. So I decided if I was going to talk about AI, maybe I'll just ask AI, what kind of answer is it going to give me? And you know what? It gave me some things that were good. It gave me some things that were, as my son would say, mid. But I would put it under three headings of what do I think that Gen AI, and I'm going to focus on Gen AI in particular, not ML, which has been long used in this area, and not agentic, which seems to be kind of the next wave, but what's Gen AI going to do? I think the biggest thing that it's going to do is it's going to unlock access to a lot of people who could not make use of some of the tools and techniques that you have now. Yes, it is a specialized skill. I think as was in some of the earlier presentations about, do I take a person who's geospatially knowledgeable and try to teach them about programming and some other things? Or do I take somebody who's a great data scientist who's never worked in a spatial realm before? Do I take a data engineer? How do I convince somebody who's just in our logistics department that there's really more that they should be able to do? And I think that this is where generative AI is going to help with that access, both allowing them to query and interrogate kinds of geospatial data that they couldn't access before, but also helping in the background in order to make that data AI ready. Facilitate collaboration, right? Do some of the translation between requests and what's possible. And then obviously, speed and efficiency. So I just kind of conclude my talk with what is that win that your stakeholders or potential stakeholders are waiting for? How can you go back and provide them with something that makes it a no-brainer to fund your project, add somebody to your team, get excited about the possibilities? What is it that you can do, and I know this sounds terrible, that makes them look good? What makes them look like they were thinking ahead, like they had some kind of knowledge, that others that they compare themselves didn't have? So, of course, I look forward to more conversations here. I look forward to, networking and everything else. And I look forward to hearing more of your stories, both where you've been trying new things, where you've been successful, where you've had to pivot and do something new, because I really do feel that the education and the evangelism of telling people about kind of what is possible is what's going to allow us to expand and grow. Thanks.